Experts are saying that first-time homebuyers are going to have a real challenge when it comes to buying property. Now, over the last 18 months, do you know what the top 3 main reasons are that first-time homebuyers bought properties? Well, the first one comes down to being financially ready. The second reason is getting a home that is safe and a secure investment. And lastly, they were hoping for greater stability or control of their living situation. In today's video, we're going to discuss lots of different first-time homebuyer stats. We're going to talk about some of the challenges. We're going to talk about where they're coming from. And if you are a first-time homebuyer, there's going to be some really great information here for you. Now, did you know there are 2 different types of first-time homebuyers? There's those that are from here and those that are not from here. We have noticed that there has been an increase of people moving here and buying right away. Typically, we have always found that people move here and then they rent. And they'll usually rent for a year or 2 and then they purchase a property. And in this article in the Calgary Herald, this is what I was quoted saying. When people move here, they usually rent for a few years before they make a decision on where to purchase. But in the last number of years, we've helped people from Germany, Spain, Israel, Brazil, Texas, and many other places who are buying sight unseen. And they aren't renting first when they get here. So RBC had their 30th annual housing ownership poll, where it said 65% of newcomers to Canada plan to buy a home in the next 2 years, where compared to 31% of the potential first-time buyers in Alberta and 29% across Canada were gonna do the same. Now, CMHC did another very interesting survey. It was all about mortgages, but there is definitely some information in there about first-time home buyers. Now, over the last, I'm assuming about 18 months, is what they did this range of purchasing. The profile that they found for first-time homebuyers was between 25 to 34 years old, and that was 56% of the first-time homebuyers. Now, $105,000 or more was the household income that they were making, and 92% of them were employed. I don't know how the 8% bought a property that weren't employed. That's impressive. Households with children, 41% had children. Single detached home, 54% of the purchases were a single detached home. And some of them actually already own rental properties. So they might have owned a rental property, bought a rental specifically, and they've never owned a primary residence. So that's most likely what that means. Now, what's really interesting when you get into this situation, a lot of the problems, the hard things for a first-time buyer is coming up with their down payment. When you're looking at saving for a down payment, on average, it says right here, home buyers had to save for 4.2 years for their down payment. And I find that interesting because there was another survey that was done by a website called Point to Homes, and they basically, it wasn't even a survey. They just kind of looked at some average numbers and kind of came up with a model. And what was really interesting is those in the age group between 25 and 35, so young millennials, in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, they were saying that the individual income, not household income, individual income was about $51,000 and $48,000 for Vancouver and Toronto. And the down payments that they needed to save up were about $129,000 and $103,000 to purchase a starter home price. Now, how they justified it and figured out what a starter home price was is they took the benchmark price, divided it in half, and that was what it is. So you're looking at $645,000 in Vancouver and $541,000 for Toronto. And so Toronto's was $108,000 for a down payment. And this is coming up with 20%. Now, if you're a first-time buyer, you do not have to bring 20% to the table. You can actually put less down. So don't think that you have to save this much money, because in another chart I found that a lot of first-time home buyers only thought that you needed maybe $20,000, $25,000 to buy a house. Well, it depends on where you live. If you have a lower price property, then yeah, you might only need to bring that. But in some cities in Canada, you definitely are going to need more than just $20,000 or $25,000 for your down payment. Now, what's really interesting is they calculated how many years to save. So it would take about 12 years and 11 years in Vancouver and Toronto. Well, when you look at Calgary, The income is $48,000, which is very similar to Toronto and Vancouver's. The house price is $303,000. So it's well less than half of what Vancouver's is and almost half of what Toronto's is. And to save up $60,000, that's 20% down, would take about 6.2 years. Now, this is also saying how the survey was done and how this analysis was done is that those that were saving up the money, the first-time home buyers, they were saving 20% of their income every single month. That's a pretty big chunk, and we'll get to some strategies later, but that's a really big chunk to be putting away every single month and really coming up with 20%. So if you're saving less per month than 20% of your income, it might take you longer, right, to save for that down payment. But it might not be 6 years, because if we go back to what CMHC found, that the average was 4.2 years across the country. In the CMHC report, it shared that the top 3 sources of down payment came as follows. The first one was savings outside of your RRSP. So 59% of buyers had savings outside of their RRSP. 38% came from gifts, and that's number 2. Number 3 was savings from within an RSP. Now, here's the interesting part. Of the 38%, a third of those would not have been able to buy at all if they didn't have that gift. And when you look at the amount that some people are getting, it actually comes down like this. The average gift was around $77,000, and BC residents, they received the largest with an average of over $150,000. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't get gifts from my family to purchase a property. We had to do it on our own. And when you're doing something on your own, it can be a little bit harder, but there can be something more satisfying about it too. So if you're in that position, don't get discouraged about other people who are getting gifts and down payments and they don't have to work for it, they just get it. You know what's the greatest thing you can do is just focus on yourself. Focus on what you can do and focus on how you can contribute to your life. Figure out where you want to go. If owning a property is what you want to do, then just figure it out. I think one of the greatest skills in life to create for yourself is to have the ability to figure it out. So I just encourage you to not get discouraged by these numbers and find joy in the process of, figuring out how to save for that down payment. The greatest joy that you can have is in the process, not in the receiving. So what do I mean by that? In the process of saving, in the process of figuring out what it is you want to purchase, how much you need to save each month, what kind of person do you want to be while you're saving? Do you still want to be charitable? Do you still want to get small getaways? What sacrifices will you make, or ways that you'll tighten up your spending so you can save more? Find the parts of you that you really enjoyed. So there might be a part of you that really enjoyed giving while you were saving. Don't let that go. Keep that a part of you as you move forward and bring those forward in your life. So as I was doing research, I came across this post in Reddit, and the title really kind of grabbed me and I wanted to dig in. And it said, genuinely curious if there's an expectation that you can buy your dream home at 30 on one salary. I was like, what? What do you mean by this? What does this mean? Well, here's what he said, or she. Housing is rough. As an older millennial, I bought my first home with my fiance, and it was a little condo by public transit so we could keep one car. But about a decade later, we upgraded to a 3-bedroom townhome. When we were buying our home, the idea of a starter home was very prevalent amongst our peers. There were also a consensus that it takes 2 salaries to buy a home. But these days, I see a lot of people expecting to buy a new 2-bedroom or more home on one salary by their early 30s and complain that it's now become impossible to do so. This expectation seems wild to me. It hasn't been possible to buy a home near most hubs on one salary for at least a few decades now. It's not just in recent years or since the pandemic. Sure, it's gotten worse since COVID, but it also feels like people have a pretty unrealistic expectation for their first home. Now, I don't know if he's fully factual with the last few decades, all those kind of things, but here is what I do know. So I recall when we first became agents, there was definitely a large handful of first-time home buyers that were looking at products that their parents owned. And they had this expectation of being able to buy what their parents have or just below what their parents have, right? So if their parents had a 2,200 square foot house, they were hoping to get into maybe a 19 or an 1,800 square foot house. I clearly remember a correlation between what their parents had and what they were looking to purchase. There was definitely a handful of people who were going, I'm just going to go to a starter thing and I'm going to start there because that's what I can afford. But there was definitely a handful of people who had this expectation. So the fact that he is or she is saying this here, I don't think it's a now thing. I think it's a first-time home buyer thing because we kind of get used to what our parents had, right? I know for my girls living in the home that we live in, they're not going to be able to afford that property right out the gate. I don't even know if I want to help them because there's something that can come out of them wanting to save up, find their own property and do all of that, which is a really great thing for them to do. And here's what I found really interesting. There was one comment in here. And what they said is, while I generally agree with your sentiment, I think not being able to do it on a single salary for decades is quite exaggerated, probably. The pandemic really did make things so much worse that $600,000 property in 2017 is now 1.2 to 1.3. Okay, well, we know that they're probably in Ontario or BC. Unfortunately, I didn't qualify to buy it back on a single income then, but if I was in the same place in my career back then as I am now, 7 years later, it would be a piece of cake. However, prices have doubled since. I'm lucky to be able to have to get in, but I know probably I'm not the norm. Yet it's wild to me that the people that really can't afford it also have the most unrealistic expectations. They need to learn to start small, and that even the definition of small has changed since their parents bought. And this really was in line with what I was saying. When you're looking to purchase, buy what you can afford. Don't stretch. Don't go too far. Don't use your credit cards for things. Don't go and get these big loans on cars and things like that. As a first-time buyer, you can do it. You can find a way to purchase a property if that is important to you. So I encourage you to do it because it's not just about owning the home. It's about the process of who you become. You're maturing in life. You're kind of growing. You can rent and become mature. I'm not saying you have to buy, but I know for myself, being a homeowner and being responsible and having rental properties, I've kind of matured and I've grown because of those things. Now, the last thing is all about interest rates. Having interest rates changing as you are purchasing a property can be quite interesting because things can become a little bit better for you when it comes to costs. So if that is where you're looking at and you're trying to figure out interest rates, go watch this video here because we talk about how experts have talked about how interest rates have not helped you yet because there could be some changes coming up.